The reject bin sat behind the Bellweather Silk Works loading dock, a gray plastic tote the size of a bathtub, and it filled up every Tuesday and Friday with Cocoons the new automated reeling line couldn't use. Joe Ferris had worked 12 years in that building before the layoff, and she still knew the schedule the machines ran on better than most of the people still employed there. She drove to the mill on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, parked at the far end of the employee lot where nobody would ask why her car was there, and walked to the loading dock with an empty 5-gallon bucket in each hand. She had called ahead. Grant Ashcombe, who managed the plant floor now that Meridian Textile Group owned the building, had said, "Sure, take what's going in the tote. It's going in a dumpster otherwise." She worked through the bin the way she used to work a reeling station, cocoon by cocoon, dropping each one into a shallow bowl of warm water she'd brought from home in a thermos, waiting for the water to loosen the Saracen gum on the outer layer, then working a fingernail gently against the surface until she found the loose end of the filament, if there was one to find. If the filament drew clean, even an inch, the cocoon was structurally intact, whatever else was wrong with it. If the shell crumbled or the water clouded gray with mold or nothing pulled free at all, it was waste genuinely, and she set it aside without a second thought. The bin manager, a young man named Denny Farrow, who ran the loading dock shift, had stopped asking what she was doing by her third visit. He'd nod at her from the dock and go back to breaking down cardboard, and she'd work through the tote, sorting cocoons into 2 coffee cans she'd brought for the purpose, one marked in Sharpie with a check mark and one marked with an X. She had reached the bottom third of the bin on a Friday afternoon in early October, when Grant Ashcombe came out of the plant office with a clipboard and saw her kneeling on the concrete with 2 coffee cans and a thermos of cooling water. Grant had run the plant floor at Bellweather for 6 years, first under the old family ownership and now under Meridian, which had bought the mill 18 months earlier and installed a fully automated reeling line that could process 400 cocoons an hour as long as every cocoon fed into it was a single, unbroken, undamaged filament. Anything that didn't meet that standard, doubles, where 2 worms had spun a single shared cocoon and produced a tangled, unreelable filament the machine choked on, stained cocoons, pierced cocoons where the moth had already emerged and cut the filament into useless short lengths, went straight into the reject tote because sorting them by hand cost more in labor than the silk was worth to a company running an automated line. He looked at the coffee cans now, the checkmark can nearly full. He said, "Joe, what are you doing with those?" She said, "Testing them." He said, "Those are going in the dumpster Monday." She said, "I know. That's why I'm testing them first." Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Joe Ferris had grown up in Colton Falls, Pennsylvania, 3 generations deep in a family that had worked the silk mills that once ran the length of the valley, back when there had been 4 operating plants instead of 1. Her grandmother, Vera Ostrowski, had worked a hand-reeling frame at Bellweather for 31 years before automation started replacing stations one at a time in the 1990s, and had also kept a small dooryard sericulture operation behind her own house for supplemental income through most of Joe's childhood. A converted chicken coop lined with mulberry racks, Silkworms raised from egg to cocoon on leaves picked from 4 mature mulberry trees that still stood, mostly untended, behind the house Joe had inherited when Vera died 9 years earlier. Joe remembered the coop mostly as a smell, warm and faintly sweet, and as a sound, the soft, continuous rustle of several thousand worms feeding at once, a sound her grandmother had once told her was the sound of money being made slowly, a nickel at a time, the old-fashioned way. Vera had stopped raising the worms herself sometime in the early 2000s, when her hands had grown too unsteady for the fine reeling work, and the market for homegrown cocoons had mostly dried up, along with everything else the valley's mills had once supported. But she had kept the notebooks, and she had kept the mulberry trees pruned back just enough that they didn't die, as though some part of her had never quite believed the work was finished for good. Joe had gone to work at Bellweather herself at 22, in the reeling room, doing by hand what the machine now did in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost. She had been laid off 14 months earlier when Meridian finished installing the automated line and eliminated 11 of the 16 hand-reeling positions in a single week, a Friday afternoon meeting that had taken 4 minutes per employee and had not included, as far as Joe could tell, any discussion of what happened to the 31 years of institutional knowledge her grandmother's generation had built and passed down one reeling frame at a time. She had been collecting unemployment, applying for work at 2 other plants in the region that were themselves shrinking rather than hiring, and spending most evenings in the house that had been her grandmother's, in a quiet she had not experienced since before the mill work started at 18. She had found Vera's notebooks in a cedar chest in the spare room that September, 6 spiral-bound volumes going back to 1968, filled with her grandmother's tight, careful handwriting, feeding schedules, molt timing, cocoon counts by season, and here and there, in the margins, technical notes that read like they had been written for someone specific, someone Vera expected to eventually need them. She found the entry that mattered in the 1979 volume, in a margin note beside a page recording a poor season. Lost most of the crop to disease that year, but kept the doubles from the year before, instead of throwing them out like the mill does. A double cocoon won't reel clean on a machine, never will. The 2 filaments cross too many times. But it'll reel by hand if you're patient, and if it won't reel at all, you can still degum it and card it like wool and spin it. Noil silk, matka silk, whatever you want to call it. Nubby, not shiny, not what the machine wants. But it's real silk, and it's not nothing. And the old buyers in Scranton used to pay good money for it because it took dye differently than the smooth stuff, and the weavers liked the texture. She read it 3 times. She had no way to ask her grandmother exactly which weavers or which buyers in Scranton, or whether any of that market still existed 40 years later, because Vera had been gone 9 years, and most of the women who had worked reeling frames alongside her were gone or long retired. What Joe had was the sentence, "It's real silk, and it's not nothing." She spent the rest of that fall and most of the winter reading everything she could find about hand-reeling technique, about degumming and carding waste silk into spun yarn, and about the difference between what an automated line rejected and what was actually unusable. Not the modern industrial textile literature, which assumed a fully mechanized process from cocoon to fabric, but the older, harder-to-find material on hand production, most of it decades out of print, some of it only available as photocopies Vera herself had made from library books in the 1970s and tucked into the back of her own notebooks. She read about Saracen, the gum that held the filament together in the cocoon, and had to be softened with warm water before reeling, and stripped entirely before spinning. She read about the difference between reeled silk, made from a single continuous filament wound directly off an intact cocoon, and spun silk, made from shorter, broken, or tangled fibers carded and drawn out the way wool was spun, which produced a duller, more textured yarn that had its own market entirely separate from the smooth, reeled product the automated line was built to produce. She read about which of the mill's rejects fell into which category. A double cocoon, two worms sharing a shell, produced a tangled filament that no automated machine could process, but that a patient hand reeler, working slowly and rejoining broken ends as she went, could still reel into usable thread, exactly as Vera had written. A stained cocoon, discolored by contact with mold or debris in the rearing tray, was often structurally perfect and reeled exactly like a clean one, rejected by the automated line purely on a cosmetic sorting standard the machine's optical sensor had been calibrated to. A pierced cocoon, where the moth had already emerged and cut the continuous filament into dozens of short pieces trying to escape, could not be reeled at all, but could still be degummed and carded into spun silk if the shell itself hadn't gone moldy. Only mold, breakage severe enough to compromise the fiber's structure, or outright rot made a cocoon genuinely worthless. She practiced the water and filament test for 2 weeks on cocoons she bought secondhand from a hobbyist supplier online before she ever brought a single reject home from Bellweather, because she did not want to misjudge a whole tote of material on instinct alone the way she suspected the automated line's optical sensor was doing. She timed the water temperature, tested how long a cocoon needed to soak before the Saracen loosened enough to find a filament end without damaging it further, and logged her error rate against cocoons she deliberately damaged herself to see whether her hands could reliably tell the difference between recoverable and truly finished. By the time she felt confident in the test, she had reeled and unreeled the same dozen practice cocoons more times than she could count, and she was not going to spend a winter's worth of labor on cocoons she hadn't tested properly. And she had read and practiced for 2 months before she ever asked Grant Ashcombe if she could take from the reject tote. Grant had said, "Sure, help yourself," though privately he thought she was spending her unemployment collecting garbage out of nostalgia for a job that wasn't coming back. Meridian had no interest in hand production. It was not a viable line item for a company that had just spent $400,000 on automation specifically to eliminate it. Joe tested cocoons from the reject tote over 6 visits across 3 weeks, kneeling at the dock with her thermos and her 2 coffee cans, sorting checkmark from X of roughly 5,000 cocoons that had come out of the tote during that stretch. Denny kept a rough running count on a clipboard for his own inventory purposes, and Joe cross-checked it against her own tally. About 1,600 tested truly unusable, mold-damaged, or too broken to hold together even for spinning. The remaining 3,400 tested structurally sound. Doubles, stains, and pierced but intact shells, exactly the categories Vera's notebook had described as salvageable 40 years earlier. She wrote in the notebook, the same kind of spiral book her grandmother had used for decades, October 11th. Roughly 5,000 cocoons collected from Bellweather, reject tote over 3 weeks. Water and filament test on all. 600 confirmed unsalvageable, mold, structural collapse. 3,400 test viable for hand reeling or spinning. Doubles and stains reel by hand. Pierced shells go to the carding batch. Nothing here was actually worthless. It just didn't fit the machine. Denny Farrow helped her load the last 2 boxes into her car trunk that afternoon, without being asked to and without Grant's knowledge, because Denny's own grandmother had worked a reeling frame at Bellweather alongside Vera Ostrowski for nearly a decade before retiring, a fact he mentioned almost as an afterthought while stacking cardboard. She set up the reeling station in her grandmother's old dooryard workshop, the converted chicken coop, where Vera had once raised the worms themselves, cleaning it out over a single exhausting weekend and installing the same kind of basin, reel frame, and low heat source her grandmother's notebooks described in careful, repeated detail. The work her grandmother's margin note had summarized in 5 sentences took Jo most of the winter to actually carry out. She reeled the doubles first, the largest category, working each cocoon in warm water, exactly the way she'd learned 12 years earlier at the mill before the machine replaced her, except now working alone, slowly, rejoining broken filament ends by hand whenever the tangled double structure caused a break, which it did constantly in the first weeks, until her hands relearned a patience the automated line had never required of anyone. She degummed and carded the pierced but intact shells into raw fiber and spun it on a drop spindle she'd found, still functional in the same cedar chest as the notebooks, producing a duller nubby yarn entirely unlike the smooth reeled thread coming off the doubles. The word around Colton Falls that Jo Ferris had been hauling reject cocoons out of the Bellweather dumpster reached the counter at Ruthie's diner before she had finished her first month of reeling. Denny had mentioned it offhand to a delivery driver named Roy Talbert, who stopped in most mornings for coffee before his route. Roy told Marlene Pruitt, who worked the counter at Ruthie's, that Jo Ferris had been out at her grandmother's old place hauling cocoons out of the mill's trash and trying to make silk out of them by hand. Marlene said, "By hand? Nobody does that anymore. That's why they've got the machine." Roy said, "That's what I said." She said, "The machine can't use them. That's why they're trash to begin with." Marlene said, "If the machine can't use them, what makes her think she can?" The next customer, a woman named Diane Okafor, who had worked the Bellweather sewing floor for 19 years before the plant downsized, had heard a different version by the time she got to the counter, one that had gathered more detail on its way from Roy to Marlene to Diane. The version she had was that Jo had taken all 5,000 cocoons the mill had thrown away in a single haul and was trying to open some kind of hand silk business out of a converted chicken coop with no equipment and no money. Diane said, 5,000 cocoons out of the trash. Marlene said, "That's what I heard too." Diane said, "What's she going to do with 5,000 rejected cocoons?" Marlene said, "Spin them into silk, from what I understand." Diane and Marlene looked at each other for a moment. Diane said, "You can't spin what the machine's already rejected." Marlene said, "That's what I said." A third woman at the counter, an older regular named Constance Halloway, who had retired from the Bellweather sewing floor a decade earlier, and remembered Vera Ostrowski well from her own younger years working the same building, said, without looking up from her coffee, "Vera Ostrowski used to spin waste silk in that same coop 40 years ago. Sold it to buyers up in Scranton for good money, from what I remember." Marlene said, "That was a different time though, wasn't it? Different market. Constance said, maybe. Or maybe nobody around here's bothered to try it in 40 years and just assumes it can't be done. Marlene did not have an answer for that, and the conversation moved on to the weather, but Constance's comment sat in the room a little longer than the rest of it had. By noon, the story had traveled the natural velocity of a story in a town with one diner and one mill, which was quickly. And by the following week, it had settled into something between pity and mild ridicule. What was accurate? Joe had taken reject cocoons from Bellweather's tote. What had drifted? The count, her intentions, and the near-universal certainty with which people repeated the prediction that machine rejects had no value a person working alone could possibly recover. Joe was in the workshop by the time the prediction had become consensus at Ruthie's counter. She had finished reeling the last of the double cocoon batch and was starting the degumming process on the pierced shells, working late into most evenings because the reeling itself could not be rushed without breaking the filament. And breaking the filament meant starting the length over from the last clean join. She reeled 210 skeins of smooth reeled silk from the doubles by the end of January, and spun another 90 skeins of nubby, matte spun silk from the pierced shells by the end of February, working almost entirely alone in the evenings after whatever part-time shift work she'd managed to pick up during the day. She wrote every count down in the notebook the way her grandmother had, without embellishment. February 28th, 210 skeins reeled silk from doubles, 90 skeins spun silk from pierced shells. Started with 3,400 salvageable cocoons out of roughly 5,000 collected. 300 skeins total is a fraction of what the mill's own line produces in an afternoon. But every skein came from something that was already headed for a dumpster. And it cost nothing but the winter it took to learn my own hands could still do this. Roy Talbert stopped his delivery truck at the end of her driveway on a Saturday in March, on his way past with a load for the feed distributor 2 towns over, and rolled down his window. He said, "Joe, I heard you've got silk out of that old coop." She said, "Some. A few hundred skeins." He said, "Out of the mill's trash." She said, "Out of cocoons the automated line couldn't process. Not out of trash." "There's a difference," he said. "What's the difference if the mill threw it out?" She said. "The mill threw it out because sorting it by hand costs more than the machine's time is worth to a company that size. That's a cost decision, not a quality decision. I tested every cocoon before I took it. 1,600 really were unusable. And I left those for the dumpster same as they would have," he said. "And the rest," she said. "The rest reel or spin exactly like any other silk cocoon, once you're willing to do it by hand instead of by machine." He looked at her for a moment, then at the coop behind her, then back at her. He said, "You always were stubborn, Joe." "Your grandmother was too, from what I remember of her," she said. "She wrote most of what I know down before I was old enough to understand why I'd need it." He didn't have much to say to that. He drove on and mentioned the exchange at the diner that evening, and the story shifted slightly again from pity toward something closer to grudging curiosity. A woman named Elena Castillo, a textile design instructor at the Regional Arts College 2 counties, over who sourced small quantities of unusual fiber for her advanced students' capstone projects, heard about Joe's silk from Diane Okafor's daughter, who was taking one of Elena's classes and had mentioned, almost as an aside during a critique session, that a woman back in Colton Falls was hand-processing mill-reject cocoons out of a converted chicken coop. Elena drove out on a Tuesday in April, walked the workshop, and handled skeins from both the reeled and spun batches, holding them up to the light coming through the coop's single window, running the nubby spun silk between her fingers with the specific, unhurried attention of someone evaluating a material rather than a story. She said, "This spun batch has a texture I haven't been able to source anywhere in-state. Most spun silk on the market now comes from overseas mills, doing it at volume with different waste categories." Joe said, "It comes from cocoons the pierced shell moths already emerged from. The machine can't reel a broken filament, but you can still card and spin the fiber." Elena said, "And the reeled batch from the doubles?" Joe said, "Slower to work than a single cocoon, because the filaments cross and you have to rejoin breaks constantly. But once it's reeled, it's just silk. There's no difference in the finished thread." Elena turned a skein over in her hands. She said, "I have 3 seniors building a sustainable materials collection for the State Fashion Week showcase in the fall. Reclaimed and upcycled fiber is the entire premise of the show. I've been telling them for 2 years that reclaimed silk at any real volume basically doesn't exist as a domestic option." She asked how much Joe could produce by September. Joe told her the truth that she had 300 skeins now and access to the mill's reject tote twice a week going forward, and that if the ratio held, she could reasonably expect close to 1,000 more skeins by late summer. Elena said, "I want first option on all of it, reeled and spun both. I'll pay a fiber sourcing rate, and I'll credit the origin on every program note and tag. Students respond to origin stories. So do the judges." Joe signed the agreement at her own kitchen table in April, the same table her grandmother had once used to record 31 years of reeling counts, and spent the following 5 months collecting from the Bellweather tote twice a week, testing every cocoon by hand exactly as she had the first 3,000, reeling and spinning in the evenings, filling the notebook with running totals the way her grandmother once had. Grant Ashcombe stopped by the workshop himself in August, a full 10 months after he'd stood on the loading dock and watched Joe kneel over 2 coffee cans with a thermos of cooling water. He looked at the workshop shelves now lined with finished skeins, reeled silk pale and lustrous, spun silk duller and textured, more than 1,000 skeins accumulated across the year. He said, "Joe," she said. "Grant," he said. "Meridian's corporate office called me last week. Somebody forwarded them a piece from the college paper about a Fashion Week collection using reclaimed silk sourced from a Pennsylvania mill's own reject stream. They wanted to know if that was us." She said, "It is. All of it came out of your tote," he said. "I've been throwing that tote in a dumpster twice a week for 18 months, she said. "You were working from a cost calculation that made sense for a fully automated line. I was working from a notebook my grandmother left 30 years before I needed it." He looked at the shelves a while longer. He said, "Corporate's asking whether we should be doing something with the reject stream instead of paying to haul it off. They use the word optics," she said. "I don't need Meridian to do anything with it. I need continued access to the tote, same as I've had all year, and I'll keep testing and processing it exactly the way I have been," he said. "I can put that in writing. Formally this time, instead of me just telling Denny to let you through the gate." He looked at a shelf of the reeled silk a moment longer. He said, "For what it's worth, I didn't think this would amount to anything when you started." She said, "Most people didn't. The State Fashion Week showcase ran the second weekend of October in a converted warehouse space in the capital, and Elena Castillo's 3 seniors closed the sustainable materials segment of the program with a 6-piece collection built almost entirely from Joe's reeled and spun silk. 2 evening pieces in the pale, lustrous reeled thread, 4 daywear pieces in the nubby, textured spun silk dyed in small batch indigo and walnut hull. The program notes credited the fiber source by name: hand-reclaimed silk, Colton Falls, Pennsylvania, sourced from mill reject stream. Joe sat in the 3rd row with Denny Farrow, who had asked to come, and watched pieces made from cocoons that had been headed for a dumpster 14 months earlier move down a runway under professional lighting in front of 400 people. A buyer from a small ethical fashion label based 2 states over approached Elena backstage afterward asking about sourcing volume for a spring line, and Elena walked her directly to Joe. Joe's niece Katie, 16, and living 2 streets over in Colton Falls, had taken to helping most weekend afternoons that fall, learning the warm water filament test the same slow way Joe had learned it from a notebook, and had come to the workshop door one Sunday, before the showcase, with a question asked the way teenagers ask things. Half embarrassed to be curious at all, she said, "Why does anybody care about silk from the trash? Isn't regular silk better?" Joe looked up from the reel frame. She said, "Regular silk from the machine is fine silk. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's not better than this, it's just different. And until last year, nobody in this whole valley was making the different kind at all, because it takes patience. The machine was built specifically not to need." Katie said, "How did you know it would work?" Joe said, "My grandmother wrote it down in 1979, 40 years before I needed to read it, back when the mill still let people work with their hands, and nobody had decided yet that patience cost too much." Katie thought about this. She said, "It's pretty." Joe held up a skein of the reeled silk to the window light, pale and faintly gold. She said, "Yes, it is." That night, after Katie had gone home and the workshop had gone quiet under an October evening, Joe sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, now in its 2nd volume of her own handwriting stacked beneath her grandmother's 6, and wrote the entry the way she wrote every entry, without embellishment. October. Full 1st year complete. 1,340 skeins total, reeled and spun, all sourced from Bellwether's Reject Tote. 6 garments from the collection shown at State Fashion Week. Formal written access agreement in place with the mill going forward. Cost of the original 5,000 cocoons, nothing. Cost of the year it took to learn my own hands could still do the work. Everything I had left after the layoff. She read the line back to herself. Then she wrote one more. Started with 5,000 cocoons the machine called garbage. 3,400 tested usable. Every one of them was real silk. It just needed a hand patient enough to find it. She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside her grandmother's 6, the place in the house where things got written down for whoever came next. Then she went out to the coop to check the last batch before dark. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that what got left behind wasn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever found real value in something everyone else had already called garbage, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.